All right, so in this last video here, we're going to look at some of the kind of remaining elements of Maya's interface. In particular, we're going to talk about the channel box and the attribute editor. Now, one thing that you will be very familiar with as you do more and more modeling is that there is a lot of information that Maya accounts for when it creates an object like this, right? So just like if you used Photoshop or Illustrator, you know that your object that you're making in, or your image that you're creating in Photoshop is made up of, say, pixels, right? Well, in Maya, these are not, we're navigating 3D space, right? And basically these objects are all defined by points in space. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later on. But the most important thing that you can know is that that information has to be stored and edited somewhere. And a lot of that information is kind of accounted for in the channel box and the attribute editor. So now you can get to the channel box and the attribute editor a couple of ways. If you've got the Maya Classic interface open, typically you'll see them right here. There'll either be two tabs up on the top here, or there'll be two tabs on the right-hand side of the screen here. And so if I click on Channel Box, let's actually bring that back open. Here are the tabs on this side of the screen. I'll bring that up. And what you can see here is that the channel box is a sort of surface level of information about my object. So if I've got my move tool active, if I just hit the W key to activate the move tool and I move this over in X a few units, you can see that this has moved 1.635 units in X. If I move it a little in Z, there it is there. And I can actually dial this in manually if I wanted this to be a very precise location. I can just type that in by clicking on the field there. I can also actually click on the translate X and then hover my mouse in the viewport and middle mouse click and drag to move it that way. I actually really like using that, so I can just translate Y and then move it up and down by just middle mouse clicking. This is why it's actually really nice to have a good functioning middle mouse button. This is why I don't really like the max middle mouse function at all. So that's the channel box, right? And we can rotate that way as well, and so on. And so you get the idea here, right? It's a pretty powerful thing. And when you start to animate someday, you'll use this a lot because you can actually right-click on these things and set keyframes and do all this other kind of crazy stuff using just this little part of the menu. And you'll also notice that as your objects become in the future more complicated, that there will be more information in the channel box. So, and then finally, below this, when you bring up the channel box, you also bring up what is called the layer editor. And the layer editor is a very nice way to kind of organize your scene visually. At first, it's going to remind you a little bit of the outliner, but it is not the same. The layer editor is more just sort of like for organizing the screen visually, but it's not like a file system, right? Like if I click on this on the object my cylinder here in the outliner and hit delete, it goes away, right? The layers menu is just more for you kind of make different little configurations of your scene, and then you can kind of control them that way. So for example, I can click on, if I've got an object highlighted in my scene, and I click on this last button on the right here called create a new layer and assign selected objects, it creates a new layer. And it puts this object in that layer. And you can name it, so I can double click on the layer and it'll bring up the edit layer menu. So I can call this cylinder. And I can give it a color. And then I can also press some of these buttons over here. So if I click on this little V, this is the visualizer button. So if I turn that off, my object goes away. If I click on it again, it comes back. And that's probably one of the most useful things about the layers editor is that you can just do that. The other thing you can do is you can click on this button right here on the right and you can make it transparent, or you can make it what is called a reference object when this little R comes up here. And that means that now I can't click on this thing. And that's actually very useful if you're, say, modeling a scene. You've got a bunch of stuff and you don't want to click on it because you don't want to accidentally move it or select things. That's where that comes into play. But most of the time, you're just going to leave this as it is. So there we go. So that's our layers editor there. And you can also just delete the layer by right-clicking, and you can go to delete layer. And there we go. Now it's as though nothing had ever happened. But it doesn't delete the object. It just deletes that functionality. Okay, so now let's talk about the attribute editor. So the attribute editor here is this little other tab, and if you don't see those tabs at all, you can usually find that tab on the right-hand side of the screen that says attribute editor. You'll also see it as this little sort of bullet pointy thing at the top of the screen. Same thing with the channel box. The channel box is this thing that looks like a little stack of paper, so you can get to them that way as well. So the attribute editor is a bit more complicated, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit more deeply later on. But one of the things about the attribute editor that you need to know is that just looking at it, so the attribute editor is kind of digging deep into the object. And you don't really need to worry about this so much right away at the beginning. But one thing that you'll be clear about is if you start to click through some of these little tabs in the attribute editor, you'll notice that we've got a lot of information that's familiar to us, like, oh, there's my rotate information, right? I can punch in, rotation, and I can rotate it. So it's, it does a lot of the same things that the channel box does. But it also does other stuff too. So you can edit the way that the object is visualized. You can edit a lot of its sort of strange properties. You can really dig deep into the object and change a lot of the under the surface stuff just by kind of digging through some of these menus. I don't recommend doing that right away. But we'll talk about some instances where you will want to do that when we start to create and model a little bit. But the one thing that you'll probably need to use the attribute editor more than anything else for is for editing materials. So right now, if we go to the end of this little list of tabs, and it's always going to be at the end on the far side here, and if I have a very condensed screen here, you can actually click over to see it. Let's just try to, yeah, I guess it's not going to do that now. But anyway, so this is what is known as a Lambert material, and this is the basic material that gets applied to everything that Maya creates in the scene. And we'll, again, talk about that a little bit more when we render, but basically here is where you make adjustments to those materials that you assign to these objects. So I wouldn't mess with the Lambert 1 settings, so it's very tempting as soon as you do this to kind of, oh, I want to make that yellow or whatever. Leave Lambert 1 alone when you see it. Always kind of leave this at its default setting. If you want to change the color of a material, which I guess we can do right now, we can just right click, go to Assign New Material, and then it will bring up this materials menu, at which point you could assign a new material and then change the color of that. So if we put a new material on there, now I can change the color, and that will be fine. And so you get the idea here. So the attribute editor is just kind of a way of digging deeper into the object a little bit. Okay, so let's just kind of do a little bit of a recap here. And then, like, by the way, if you're wondering what's happening down here at the bottom of the screen, these are your animation controls for playback and things like that. And we won't really be messing around with that very much. And so don't worry about this at the beginning. In fact, you can even get rid of it on your screen if you want to. It doesn't really matter. It's just going to be taking up space in this first section of the class.